feel free to write me and point those questions. The TEEP project began with the desire of a group of European environment ministers and the G8 plus 5 to think of some way of replicating or providing economic argument for nature conservation along the same lines that the Stern Review had just done. I'm talking about 2007 now. Stern had just come out with a strong economic case for why early action against climate change makes more sense than doing nothing. And these people were wondering in Potsdam and then in Heiligendamm, why can't that work for nature? That was the genesis of it, and it's come a long way since then. It began as a sort of Stern-inspired review of biodiversity losses, but effectively it became a complete project to look at the total span of the economic value that nature delivers into the economy, but most of it is in the nature of public goods and services, so they're free. In other words, what you get from a forest in terms of fresh water and soil, nutrients and so on, typically comes through free. You don't have to pay for it. What you get in terms of access to beautiful forests and natural areas, with a few exceptions, you can have free access, and therefore that's free. And we've also found in the TEEP study that most of the free access really matters to the poorest. In fact, in my country, India, we did that study thanks to the GIST numbers being available. We asked the question, total nature services, fresh water, soil nutrients, and so on and so forth, flood prevention, drought control, you can actually measure the impacts on these things. The answer was coming up to only about 7% of GDP. In other words, the missing bits that nature delivers to India was coming up as 7% of GDP plus minus. We thought that didn't sound very impressive, but when we asked ourselves the question, hang on, to whom did these benefits flow? To whom did these benefits flow? So if the forest stops delivering fresh water and nutrients, who suffers? Oh, the poor farmer suffers. Or if the villagers can't take their cattle and feed them based on the grasses and the leaf litter that's in forests, who suffers? Oh, guess what? The poor villager suffers. If you can't fish near the mangroves and near the coral reefs, who suffers? Oh, guess what? The poor fishermen. And so on. And if there is an unseasonal flood or there is extended drought, who suffers? Well, not you and I, because we've got enough money to go buy food more expensively in the supermarket. But who suffers is once again the poor farmer. So what we're talking about is not in terms of looking at a percentage of GDP, but actually a percentage of the GDP of the poor. And we total that up because there was, as Tony rightly mentioned, there was enough data available, so we could actually look at the bottom end of the farming spectrum. We could look at fisheries separately, etc., etc. And when we did that calculation, in other words, nature services as a fraction of the GDP of the poor, that answer was 60%. It wasn't 7%, it was 60%. And that's the problem, and that's the challenge. You see, it's always very glibly said that, oh, biodiversity, it's a luxury for the rich. If you're talking about biodiversity, it means you don't care about the poor, you don't care about development, etc., etc. The reality is, and the economic reality is, that it's quite the opposite. We have a lens which is broken, basically because we do not capture public wealth. We only capture private wealth. Elinor Ostrom, the recent Nobel Prize winner, has done a lot of work in that area, and her basic thesis is that if you entrust public wealth to communities, it tends to work. In other words, they don't deplete it. But if you just entrust public wealth to either governments or the private sector, all you get is the tragedy of the commons. And that's pretty much a theme that's running throughout the whole of TEEP. TEEP just stands for TEEB, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity. Subsequently, we've done more work and come out with TEEP for the policymaker, because there's no point doing the economics and just presenting it amongst economists and people like yourselves who are educated and understand. But you have to get action. To get to action, you need to convince people. Who do you convince? You need to convince decision makers. Who are the decision makers? Well, clearly policy makers, number one. Then there's administrators. You can have the right policy, but if the rules out there say that thou shalt create 10,000 jobs next year and then 12,000 the year after that, well, guess what? As an administrator, you will do exactly that. Destroy the forest, give it to some company or the other who says they'll create 10,000 jobs, and no, it's not my problem to figure out what happened, because I met my target. Procedure said so. So there's a lot of administrative level, process level attention that needs to be paid. And then who else you have to convince? Well, corporate CEOs. Because the corporation has been described as a cost externalizing machine by some people. And the reality is that, we are at a point, at a turning point, where we need to redefine and rethink the nature of the corporation and tomorrow's corporation, and who else but Tony McWaring to tell you that, is going to be quite different from today's corporation. So all these things need to be translated across into language that the business CEO can understand in terms of the additional risks, the additional opportunities, and the impact of the corporation on nature, economic impact, and measured in economic terms. And lastly, and I come back to Tony's point, who else needs to understand this? Mr. and Mrs. Smith, or in India, Mr. and Mrs. Patel. People on the street, they need to understand that natural capital, which is what this is all about, natural capital is not somebody else's, it's their wealth. If you're an Indian, then 1 out of 1.1 billion of the total natural capital of India belongs to you because you're a citizen. If you're British, then 1 in 55 millionth of its natural capital belongs to you. That sense of ownership, that sense of recognition that, hey, this is mine, that has to happen. And that with that recognition will come a change of mentality in how you do things. Sometimes the change of mentality can be very simple. In the fisheries is a case in point. We go a lot into fisheries and team, and the latest web version that you read will have a lot on that. But one of the silly stories of fisheries is that, yes, it's tragedies of the common, yes, it's overfishing in high seas because of the laws, and yes, it's $34 billion worth of subsidies for an industry whose landed catch is only 90 billion, so that kind of suggests that it's slightly dependent on subsidies. And a lot of those subsidies, my friend Rashid Sumela in British Columbia University calls subsidies either good or bad or ugly, and according to his calculations, the bad and ugly subsidies within the fisheries are 25 billion out of the 34 billion. So that kind of tells you a story. But the reality is, how do you stop that? Well, by recognizing a simple biological fact, which is that a female fish, if allowed to grow twice the size, produces typically 10 to 100 times as many eggs. Which means if you do not fish in areas where you were fishing to the bottom, in other words, involved in the race to the bottom, you can actually restore fisheries. Now, how simple this is, I promise you, I can explain this to any Mr. and Mrs. Smith or any Mr. and Mrs. Patel. It's so simple, and the economics of protected areas works. You just need, over the next 3 years or 5 years, or as long as it takes in that area, to provide some support, some income support, and alternative livelihoods to the people who are directly dependent on these, whilst they are kept away. As soon as the fisheries recover, which is typically 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, you find an amazing phenomenon of everyone fishing at the boundary of the protected area. And I've actually got a lovely picture, which I can't show you now right now, but I can send it to you, of trawler fleets off Cape Cod of the US, where from a distance it looks like there's nothing happening in the protected area, and then you look at the color coding, and you look at the dots, which are the largest number of vessel hours, and there's a cloak of red dots all around the protected areas. So all the fishing is happening there. This is an actual example which restored 70% of the haddock catch of the United States simply because they declared the protected area. Now, I use this example to illustrate you, and this is the economics of protected areas for fisheries. How easy that was to explain, but the point is, how many people out of the 6.3 billion on Earth actually get it, or have got it, or have heard this? No. Nobody has understood the story, nobody has explained it, and we need to communicate these messages for Mr. and Mrs. Smith and Mr. and Mrs. Patel to understand that's what TEEB's last and final output is going to be. That's planned for next year. We have to be ready. It's not going to be a booklet like everything else that TEEB has. It's not going to be a massive economics and ecology volume like the underlying document of TEEB is 600 pages long, right? Don't try and read that unless you're really, really serious. But the point is, stuff like this, which comes out of that science and economics, this has to be understood. Otherwise, change will not happen. Unless people understand and stop voting for the same people who don't change a depletion of their wealth, which is in the hands of politicians, there's going to be no change. So I think this is why it's really important. We need to get these messages right down to the person on the street.